So today we're going to be taking a look at a scenario where NATO and CSTO go to war. Now NATO and CSTO are probably the two largest military alliances in the world. Now more notably it would be NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, but I've already done that video, so now it's time to do the CSTO, which is essentially a scaled down version of the Warsaw Pact. We will also have other countries join in on this, so it won't just be NATO. And it won't just be the CSTO. Each of them will have their allies, which will help out. And yeah, so if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. And let's go ahead and get started. Now, in order for this war to start, we're gonna have someone pull the trigger. Both NATO and the CSTO are like around this area, so the main points of conflict would be where they border. So maybe something down here, obviously something with Ukraine. We have something with Finland and the Baltics, Belarus and Poland, Ukraine getting invaded by Russia, something happening over here. There's a multitude of different ways that this war could start, and I'm going to be doing it a different way than I usually do. Usually I do something with Ukraine, but that kind of gets boring after time, so let's do something down here in the Caucasus. Now Armenia is a member of the CSTO and Turkey is a member of NATO, and if you know anything about these two countries, they absolutely hate each other. And there's a lot of things that happened in this area which are well, I guess debated between the two sides. Now them starting a conflict in present day isn't likely, but in this fictional scenario, that's what's going to be starting this war. And this might also kick off a war over here in the Middle East, getting a lot of these countries involved, but we will go into that later. So here we have Turkey, a member of NATO, and we're going to say that they accidentally did some funny stuff over here in Armenia. Now I'm not exactly sure how this would start. Maybe Turkey accidentally crossed the border, Armenia opened fire, or vice versa, but both countries claim they are in the defense, and both countries activate their respective articles of their alliances. So here we have the CSTO, which is pretty much a shell of the Soviet Union, and here we have NATO, which has only expanded since its creation. Now I did choose to include Sweden and Finland here because why not? They are almost members. I think there's only 5 countries which haven't ratified their accession protocols, and those countries would be Hungary, Slovakia, Turkey, obviously Greece, and I think Spain. All other countries have either started their protocols or have finished it, such as the United States, who recently fully ratified. I know Canada was the first, but we're not talking about that. Let's go ahead and start with this war. Now, almost immediately, other countries would get involved since, you know, each country has respective allies. But we're just going to go ahead and say for the first day, no one joins in, and we have Turkey invading Armenia. Now, this may or may not have been premeditated. However, Turkey finds ease pushing into the small country. And on the next day, we have Azerbaijan joining in on the side of NATO, because Azerbaijan and Armenia are each other's greatest rivals. Maybe Armenia and Turkey, debatable, but these guys just fought a war in 2020 and they finally finished, so there's that. Azerbaijani troops cross over and meet up with their exclave, and from here the CSTO gets its first ally, which is going to be Iran. Now in real life, Iran is a close ally of Russia and a strong hater of, well, the West. Also, I just noticed that this is probably the first time ever that the West has been red, probably because I'd see Turkey as an aggressor in this situation with Armenia. But yeah, it's a change for once, and it's kind of weird. But yeah, Iran joins in on the CSTO, and this may or may not ignite a whole civil war over here in the Middle East, but we'll see. For now, it's just Iran joining in. And unfortunately, Georgia gets dragged into this war, mostly because they want to get the Russians out of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, but also because they're getting invaded by Russia either way. So the Russian forces that are already in Georgia start to push around and start to capture the parts of the country. We also have Russian troops crossing over into northern Azerbaijan, while Iranian troops cross in from the south. Turkey and Azerbaijan managed to take out all of Armenia and even start a campaign into northern Iran. However, this campaign is very slow as this is a very mountainous region. Over on the front line, we have Poland pushing into Belarus, while we have Russia and Belarus pushing into the 3 Baltic states. A stalemate is established on the Finnish border, and North American troops are starting to arrive in Europe. Now, something we do have to factor in here is Ukraine, who is currently being invaded by Russia in real life. Now, they would automatically default into this war on the side of NATO since, you know, they share a common aggressor and they are also allies with NATO. So in one way or another, Ukraine joins this war even though they were kind of already in it. And with that, of course, we have to establish Russia's current front line, which is something roughly like this. So now with the entire Russian military mobilized and en route to Europe, we have Russia's invasion of Ukraine ramping up. Now in current day, they haven't made an advance since July, but now they're using their entire military, which means they have a lot more capability. They push over to Moldova, which essentially separates southern Ukraine from the rest of Ukraine. And now Russia, along with Belarus, start a campaign towards Kyiv. The West is quick to move troops into Ukraine to hold off the Russians, although they don't really have the numbers to outweigh the Russian superiority. So for now, they just slowly push in. Back down in the Caucasus, we have Russia almost capitulating Georgia while meeting the border of Turkey. At the same time, Russia and Iran managed to push into Azerbaijan and eventually connect fronts, which leads to a slow capitulation of the country, although they do manage to hold out for now. Down in the Middle East, we have an ignition starting with Saudi Arabia joining the war on the side of the United States. And this is mostly because they share a rivalry with Iran. Also joining in on this war is Israel, who joins in on the red side, since, you know, Iran and Israel absolutely hate each other. Now, in terms of nuclear bombs, I don't really know if that would be used. I'm assuming so, since Russia's kind of a loose trigger, and then Israel and Iran are also loose triggers. All of them most likely have nuclear capabilities. I mean, Iran might, other than the ones that have been like bombed by NATO, but you know, they probably have hidden chambers and stuff. But with Israel joining, this starts a whole lot of controversy. We have Lebanon joining in on the blue team, in Syria getting invaded by Turkey, and ultimately Iraq finds its way into this war. Jordan opts to stay neutral, as well as Palestine, but Kuwait ends up getting invaded by Iran and Iraq, and with this, Oman and the UAE joining in on the side of Saudi Arabia. And from here, Russia gets Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan to join in on this war. Now, the whole conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, I don't know if that would affect this war at all, most likely because they're on the same team, but we're just going to put that aside for now and just kind of let this play out. Back over in Europe, we have the Polish and Ukrainian armies managing to push further into Belarus until eventually Russian troops arrive to stop their advance. Up north, Russia's advance into Latvia extends itself over to the coast, and with this, Latvia is split into two, which essentially separates Estonia from the rest of NATO. Now, naval-wise, NATO is absolutely dominating Russia. I mean, the Black Sea might be like a coin toss, but over here in the Baltic Sea, it is 100% NATO superiority. They do use this to their advantage, although it's not enough to stop Russia's advance to Estonia, which eventually capitulates. Riga is in sight and is eventually captured, which leads to the unconditional surrender of Latvia, and now the only Baltic state that is left is Lithuania. NATO attempts to push into Kaliningrad, although it is heavily fortified and they don't find much progress, although the Russians there are starving now. Eventually, most of them surrender and Kaliningrad is captured. In Belarus, we have a NATO campaign which is aimed at taking Minsk, although this fails. And the same could be said for the Russian campaign in Ukraine. They have a campaign to take Kyiv, but this also fails. Over in the Caucasus, we have Azerbaijan capitulating, and this leads to the slow liberation of Armenia. Azerbaijan's exclave is captured, and Turkey is the only country holding a front. Georgia finds itself capitulating to Russia, and now it really is only Turkey versus everyone else. But going down to the Middle East here, we have some events taking place, such as Kuwait getting occupied, Israel pushing up into Lebanon and southern Syria, and Saudi Arabia advancing into Iraq. The Persian Gulf is getting bombarded by each side, with the Navy aiming to take out ports along the coast. Now, focus-wise, the United States is mostly focused over here in Eastern Europe, but as well as down here in Saudi Arabia. The UK is invested in Europe, France is invested in Europe and Turkey. We have Italy going to both, and obviously these Eastern European countries are sending their troops to the front line in order to stop them from being invaded. Probably the smart thing to do. Is at this point in the war that Moldova unconditionally joins the war on the side of NATO in order to give some leeway for them and also give them advantage in pushing back the Russian troops over here near Odessa. This is ultimately a good play for NATO as they manage to push back these Russian troops close to Kherson. Unfortunately for NATO though, Russia manages to finally meet the Dnieper, which is basically a river border with all of Ukraine. If I remember, it goes something like that, I think. But Russia is now hugging up against that in the south and is soon going to cross it over here in the north. But Russia is hugging up against it in the south and is advancing towards it in the north. Up north, we finally have someone making a play, and it's actually Finland pushing down towards St. Petersburg. Now, this is a very small advance and is eventually stopped, but they do aim to push over towards this lake, in which they do successfully, cutting Russia's supply lines off in these two areas. We also have Finland aiming to push over here and cut off Russia from the Kola Peninsula, which will basically just, I mean, Russia has a lot of defense systems up here, and most of them are nuclear. Not sure if they would use them. I mean, if they were going to use them, this would be a vital area to take. But since they aren't using them, there isn't too much value to this. In Belarus, we have Russia and Belarus pushing back NATO. This is mostly due to their failed campaign to take Minsk, in which they took up a lot of resources. But NATO is eventually pushed back, and all of southern Belarus is liberated by the Russians. Poland manages to keep its front line, although it is heavily contested. And from here, the Belarusians and Russians push into northern Ukraine over here in the west. Down in the Middle East, we have Turkey and Israel meeting up, which essentially establishes a nice supply line between the two countries. And from here, they start to bully Syria even more than it's being bullied in real life. The Syrian government starts to fall apart, as well as the rebel groups. A lot of guerrilla warfare is happening here, but eventually Syria surrenders. And now we have Turkey, Israel, and Saudi Arabia meeting up in Iraq. Iranian troops are now being pushed over towards Iraq in order to hold off the Turks, Israelis, and Saudis. But they're also being sent up north to push Turkey out of Iranian territory. This goes well since they use their mountains to their advantage, but Turkey does manage to hold on to Armenia. Turkey also pushes the Russians back out of their country and into Georgia, since Russia is dealing with a lot of fronts here. Ultimately, Russia would be at an extreme disadvantage in real life since, you know, they're going from Finland to the Baltics to Poland to Ukraine and down to Turkey, and essentially even Azerbaijan if they were to decide to join in on NATO's side in real life. Now at this point, the entire world is just kind of watching. I mean, I don't think it's going to extend to any other countries. Other countries really wouldn't have a point in joining in unless like one of the sides was an evil dictator. So yeah, the world just kind of watches. I mean, maybe Australia and New Zealand would get involved, but I mean, they could. It would be beneficial to NATO, extremely beneficial. But also that could maybe invoke China to join the war. I mean, if it's a NATO war against China, Australia is definitely joining in. They have an interest in fighting back China's influence over here in Southeast Asia. But if it's just Russia versus NATO, they might sit this one out. I don't know. Also, for the rest of the European countries, Ireland's neutral, Switzerland and Austria, they're neutral. Serbia, Kosovo, and Bosnia and Herzegovina could join in on this war, but that would only happen if Russia were to reach Serbia and give them a reason to join. But for now, if Serbia were to join, they would get absolutely obliterated by NATO, and they don't want 1999 to happen again. So yeah, they're just gonna refrain, which is probably the smartest thing Serbia's ever done. Over in Lithuania, NATO troops continue to be pushed back until they eventually establish a stalemate with Russia. This is extremely good because they don't want Russia to reach over to Kaliningrad, and also good because, well, Russia advancing is not good for NATO. However, Russia's advancing Ukraine continues, and then now pushed back towards Odessa. We have Kharkiv falling, and eventually Kyiv, which is pretty much right here, is surrounded on 3 sides. Almost 4. NATO has a successful campaign in stopping Russia's full encirclement, which is a good relief for Ukraine, although holding them off is costing a lot of resources and manpower. NATO launches a counteroffensive in the south, which is aimed at creating an encirclement down here towards Kherson. It starts to go very well until eventually Russia starts to withdraw troops, and the encirclement they wanted to get is not achieved. Instead, they get a smaller one, although this is still pretty crucial. So right now we have the front lines looking like this, so the CSTO is probably having the most success. Looking at this, NATO is only really seeing a lot of victory down in the Middle East, and right now they're just focusing on holding off the Russians until they can eventually overwhelm the Russians, and that's also just kind of a big if. The CSTO isn't really that strong. I mean, it's basically just Russia, Belarus, and Iran. These Central Asian countries don't have much to offer. Meanwhile, NATO has some pretty strong countries in it, such as, you know, the United States, obviously, France, the UK, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Finland, of course, is also a strong country. They've been training since, you know, they kind of got their independence to fight Russia. And I don't think they're going to let that opportunity down. Speaking of such, they push further towards St. Petersburg, and Russia starts to rearrange some troops in order to hold off Finland from capturing one of their largest cities. This effect is seen in the Baltics, where NATO manages to push Russia all the way out of Lithuania, and they even start a small campaign towards Riga. Eventually, a large encirclement is made, similar to what happened in World War II, with a lot of troops being trapped over here in Latvia. These troops can escape due to NATO's naval superiority over here. I said that like 3 times in 3 different takes. And yeah, these troops just end up surrendering, which is also a blow to Russia. Back down in the Middle East, we have the red team managing to push into Iraq and eventually capture Baghdad. Iran is now on the defensive, attempting to hold back the red team. Meanwhile, Turkey goes full on offensive, now pushing back into Armenia as well as Georgia. Russia's also holding a defensive up here, so they just kind of stalemate this, and eventually we have something that looks like this. Iran holds strong in its mountains over here, so we don't have Turkey entering in over there yet. And down south, we have the liberation of Kuwait. But hey, Kuwait a minute, because Kuwait is pushing into Iraq. NATO relaunches Operation Minsk, but they first have to push Russian troops out of northern Ukraine, which goes successfully. They then re-push into Belarus, at the cost of losing some ground in central Ukraine. At this point, the West is barely holding on to Kyiv, but they do attempt to hold out. More troops start to arrive in Ukraine, and eventually a stalemate is established on all fronts. Up north, NATO's invasion of Belarus goes even better as they start to near the capital city. In the Baltics, we have Belarus and Russia making a quick grab of Lithuania's capital, although this is seen as kind of stupid as they lose more ground up north. The Russian rearranged troops now meet up with Finland and start to push them back until eventually they are stalemated. Totally not because the month is January or anything. Also, that campaign I was talking about earlier, Finland starts to carry it out, and due to Russia's severe lack of defense up north, they manage to pull it off. Now the Kola Peninsula is at the mercy of Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and essentially it just falls as there's no way to get up there because Finland kind of took the transportation routes. Now this isn't really 100% controlled. I mean, obviously not. They can't really control this. It's just a bunch of ice. There's also like nobody there, so maybe they can control it. In the Middle East, the Iraqi army capitulates, which leads to Iran being the only army fighting against NATO. Turkey continues to push back the Russians in Georgia, and the country is finally reestablished. Over in Ukraine, Russia changes up its game plan and starts to push down in the south in order to capture the Black Sea coast of the NATO countries. Now, Putin's logistics here say that this is a very bad idea since, you know, they're going to be prone to being cut off, but he goes through with it anyway. Push down to capture all of southern Ukraine and even enter into northern Romania, but eventually the exact same thing they warned about happens and these troops get cut off. Not good. They all die. And that was a big mistake for Russia because now NATO can easily push back in the south, almost completely pushing into Crimea. The Crimea bridge is absolutely obliterated by NATO forces, and they managed to push over and cut off Crimea from the rest of Russia. Not good for Russia. Immediately with this, they start a long campaign into the peninsula, which costs a lot of manpower on both sides, but eventually they manage to take it all over, and Russia loses a lot of its Black Sea ports over here. With this, we kind of have Russia being blockaded. I mean, they were already being blockaded by Turkey, now even more. So Yeah, Russia's starting to starve. They can only import from the east, and the only place they're really doing that is along this southern coast. And also, of course, from China. I mean, that's a pretty easy import. But it does take forever to get over here to the west, which is where all of their population is. In Belarus, NATO spikes up and captures Minsk, which is their ultimate goal over here in the east. From here, they push up and around and eventually start to make an encirclement. Russian troops in this area start to withdraw, and this area falls to NATO. In Ukraine, we have NATO continuing its campaign against the Russians, and this time they're invading from the south, which is seen as a lot more effective from trying to push back in the north. Over here in the Caucasus, Turkey manages to take back all of Armenia and starts its liberation of Azerbaijan. Iran still manages to hold off its borders, but is slowly losing ground to NATO in Iraq. Iraq eventually capitulates, and Iran defends its border, and nobody manages to get in. Iran also eventually orders all of its troops out of Azerbaijan, which leads to a full liberation of southern Azerbaijan, but in turn for this, the red team is unable to invade Iran. Iran starts to tell Russia to kind of maybe, sue for peace here. They can get some land out of this in Ukraine. And, this might be beneficial just to leave this war. But Russia insists it keeps going and sees what happens, and a whole lot of pushing back happens. Stalemate is eventually established on the Georgian and Azerbaijani-Russian border, and nobody makes any advances, so the Middle East at this point is completely stalemated. Up north in Europe, we have Russia making a campaign to cut NATO off from their southern portion of Crimea, and this actually goes successfully, and they manage to cut them off. The problem is NATO now has naval superiority, so they're able to supply this area, and with time, their front line starts to be pushed back in central Ukraine, which leads to the eventual reconnection with this part. In that time span, though, they were able to push NATO back, but they weren't able to recapture Crimea. NATO now sees its weak point over here in this point, and they push that back, and eventually Crimea is out of Russian sight. The Kyiv area is pushed back, and eventually the city is no longer in danger. Well, I mean, it's still in danger, but not as much as before. In Belarus, we have the Russians attempting to retake Minsk, although at this point, they don't really have much luck, as the Russian army is losing all of its morale. Same with NATO, but just not on as large of a scale as Russia, who is pretty much starving at this point. So we have an event taking place which might have been staged by the CIA, but eventually Putin just gets shot in the head, and that kind of ends Russia's authoritarianness. The new leader of Russia is elective, probably also a dictator, but they decide they want to pull out of this war, and Russia leaves the war, which essentially leads to the CSTO surrendering. So yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at this peace treaty here. All right, taking a look at this peace treaty here, we don't have it being too harsh on the CSTO. I mean, on the surface, it doesn't look that bad for Russia or any of Central Asia, or even Iran for that matter. But internally, some things have changed, so let's just go ahead and start with the border changes. Finland gets a good share of Russia's northern parts over here. So originally their border was like something over here like that. They get access to the Arctic Sea now, and they also get a little bit rounded off over here in this area of Russia. Estonia gets this chunk of land. We have Latvia and Lithuania getting a chunk of land, and then of course Poland, who gets a portion of this part of Belarus. And then we have this partition of Kaliningrad between Lithuania and Poland. Now Ukraine is an interesting topic here. Now since Russia did withdraw from the war, it kind of doesn't let them gain any of the land that they lost, although the Russia's leader does kind of negotiate with NATO, but they basically said that if you give us a portion of Donetsk and Luhansk, and then we would be open for peace. Ukraine was very against that deal, although in the end they ended up getting more land anyway out of Belarus and parts of Russia. They also get their full claim over Crimea back, and of course this area is heavily Russian, so I mean, it would probably be more of a hassle to keep it. Coming on down to the Caucasus, we have Armenia still existing, although it's very not much there. Azerbaijan gets this exclave, Georgia gets a little bit of land, and Turkey gets a little bit of land out of Armenia. Speaking of Georgia, Russia withdraws all of its troops from Georgia, and over here in the Middle East we have a partitioning of Syria and Iraq, who are eventually combined into one central Middle Eastern state. Very unstable, and is most likely going to get partitioned again by its neighbors. Iran actually gets out of this war scot-free. Nothing happens to them, but as for Belarus, they're given a new government which is pro-NATO, although it's a little bit unstable. And yep, that's right, baby. Reverse Alaska has made its return to my videos. This is just oil, and the United States loves its oil. These islands were also annexed by the US and given back to Japan, so that's kind of nice. But overall, the West has sort of won this war. I mean, Russia just kind of lost influence. They also got a new ruler, which may or may not be as aggressive as Putin. So maybe Russia can turn this around and actually, be open to a relationship with the West. But hey, I don't know. It's a fictional scenario. So if you guys did enjoy it, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. We're trying to grow out this channel, and we're reaching 100,000 subscribers by the end of this year. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Also, wait, hold on, before I leave. Now, I know I didn't do an alternative feature video this Saturday, and I apologize for that, but I really just wanted to get this video in particular out there because I think you guys would actually enjoy it. So yeah, once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.